and thrown it over my arm.
This is a tragic situation, and I hurt more than anyone. Okay, I'm the father. That was my baby girl.
The last time I saw her was in the hospital with a bunch of tubes sticking
Brandon Hullman could not hold back his tears while watching videos and pictures of his daughter Hazel.
On Halloween of 2019, a woman in Bellingham, Washington posted a photo to social media. She was dressed as Cruella de Vil. Her boyfriend stood beside her as her accomplice, and the little girl in the picture, 3 years old, dressed as a puppy, would be gone in less than 4 weeks. That little girl's name was Hazel Journey Hullman. And what makes this true crime documentary different from anything you've seen before is this. The system didn't miss one warning sign. It missed dozens. Calls from family members, reports from educators, flags raised by medical professionals. Every single one of them documented, filed, and lost in a paper trail while a child ran out of time. This is not a story about one person. This is a story about how an entire system designed to protect the most vulnerable looked the other way, one form at a time. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe right now. We cover true crime documentaries like this one every single week. Real cases, real failures, real consequences. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. On March 13, 2016, at a hospital in Shelton, Washington, a man named Brandon Hullman held his daughter for the first time. She came into the world not breathing. Doctors moved fast, and after a terrifying few moments, she let out her first cry. Brandon made a promise to himself in that room. He was going to protect this little girl from everything. Her name was Hazel Journey Hullman. And from the very start, she was a fighter. Hazel grew into exactly the kind of kid who lights up a room without even trying. Long chestnut hair, big brown eyes sitting behind round little glasses that made her look like a tiny owl. Her family had a nickname for her. Hazel Bug. Little Bug. And it fit perfectly because she never walked anywhere. She ran. Everywhere she went, she ran, like she was afraid the world was going to start without her. She had rituals. Every single morning, she would wake up before the rest of the house, creep into her father's room, and he'd whisper in his ear, "Daddy, time to wake up." Just the two of them, quiet, before the day started. Then she'd be in the kitchen asking for chicken nuggets, for breakfast, dipping every single one in ketchup. That was Hazel. But the thing that stood out most about this little girl, the thing that everyone who knew her would come back to again and again, was that she could read a room in a way that most adults never learn. If someone looked sad, Hazel noticed, she'd climb right into their lap without being asked and quietly hum a little tune. Her grandmother Tammy would later describe it as a gift, the ability to feel what other people were feeling and do something about it. She organized games so nobody got left out. She brought her grandmother handfuls of leaves, smooth pebbles, and the occasional earthworm as if they were treasure. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, or a princess. She hadn't fully decided yet, and there was no rush. But Hazel's world, as warm and full of a life as she was, had cracks in it from the very beginning. Her mother, Medora, was 17 years old when Hazel was born. Her father, Brandon, was 26. Both of them were dealing with serious personal struggles, dependency issues, emotional instability, and an inability to build the kind of steady home a child needs. Brandon had a history of run-ins with law enforcement, and while nobody who knew him questioned that he loved his daughter, love alone does not make a stable household. Then on November 2nd, 2017, when Hazel was just 19 months old, everything shifted. Brandon and Medora got into a serious argument at their apartment on Queen Street in Bellingham. It escalated. Concerned relatives called the police. When officers arrived, Brandon refused to open the door. After a tense standoff that lasted several hours, he was taken into custody. And little Hazel, caught in the middle of all of it, was placed into the temporary care of Child Protective Services. She was handed over that same day to her paternal grandparents, Tammy and Dale Mortons, who lived in Olympia. But according to the family, it didn't come without conditions. They were told to sign an agreement giving the department full control over any future decision, to return the child to her parents. If they didn't sign, Hazel wasn't going home with them that night. They signed. When Hazel arrived at her grandparents' house, she was not in good shape. She had dental problems from inadequate care. She woke up screaming in the night. Tammy and Dale stayed up with her, took her to doctors, took her to the dentist, and surrounded her with the kind of consistency she had never known. Over the next year and 7 months, something remarkable happened. Hazel blossomed. She became the healthy, joyful, thriving child she always had the potential to be, and for a while, it looked like her story might have a good ending after all. But the system had other plans. While Hazel was thriving in Olympia, the clock on reunification was already ticking. Child Protective Services had given both parents a list of requirements: dependency treatment, parenting classes, psychological counseling, complete the program, demonstrate stability, and the path to getting Hazel back would open up. Medora never made it through. She skipped meetings. She dropped out after the first week. She stopped showing up for scheduled visits with her own daughter, even when the department offered to cover her travel costs. By the fall of 2018, she had moved to Iowa to live with her own mother, and regular contact with Hazel faded away entirely. Brandon took a different path. He got a job, he attended parenting classes, he checked in with his probation officer and passed his tests. He was doing the work, at least on paper. And a big part of what was pushing him forward was a new woman in his life, a woman named Cammy Dixon. Cammy was determined. She encouraged Brandon to fight for his daughter. She submitted to a background check despite having her own history: property offenses, violations of court procedures. She was told to complete rehabilitation programs and secure employment. She did both. And once she cleared those requirements, she was permitted to accompany Brandon on his visits with Hazel. By December of 2018, the department held a formal meeting to determine the best permanent placement for Hazel going forward. Brandon was emerging as the leading option. In February of 2019, after a check of his residence, visits were expanded to include full weekends with overnight stays. Cammy technically maintained her own separate apartment in Bellingham to satisfy the requirement of independent housing, but in practice, she was at Brandon's place most of the time, and when Brandon was there, so was Hazel. Then on June 19, 2019, the decision was made official. After nearly 2 full years in the care of her grandparents, Hazel Journey Hullman was returned to live with her father. That same day, Cammy went on social media and posted photographs of Hazel's new bedroom, pink and gold, Disney princesses on the walls, every detail staged to perfection. The caption talked about a little girl's fantasy come to life. In the weeks that followed, Cammy's profile filled up with pictures: Hazel smiling, Hazel sleeping surrounded by stuffed animals, Hazel posing in cute outfits, a perfectly curated portrait of a happy family living their best life. Brandon was working 6 days a week, commuting roughly 2 hours each way. That meant that on the days Hazel wasn't at daycare, the person responsible for her was Cammy. Not Brandon, Cammy. On paper, everything looked exactly the way the department needed it to look: stable home, employed father, attentive caregiver, child enrolled in daycare. The social worker assigned to the case was required to visit twice a month given Hazel's young age, and the reports that came back were clean every single time. House is tidy, refrigerator is stocked, child is attending daycare. Check, check, check. But underneath that surface, something was very wrong. It took less than 2 months for the first visible sign to appear. On August 3rd, relatives who were watching Hazel for the weekend noticed unusual dark pink marks on her arms. They took photographs. They called Child Protective Services immediately. The response they got was textbook: someone will be out to conduct a visit soon. Days passed. Hazel stayed in that house. And the clock kept moving. Around the same time, a woman named Autumn, a friend of Cammy's, witnessed something that made her uncomfortable enough to step in and stop it on the spot. She intervened in the moment, but afterwards she stood there wondering if what she had seen was serious enough to report to someone. It hadn't looked like an obvious threat. But Cammy's behavior had been deeply unsettling. Autumn stayed quiet. She would not speak about what she saw until she took the witness stand at trial. By September, the educators at Hazel's daycare were noticing changes. The little girl who had always been energetic, talkative, and quick to include everyone around her had gone quiet. She was withdrawn. They contacted the hotline. But the case was in the middle of a staff transition, bouncing from one social worker to the next due to routine rotation. Nobody had the full picture because nobody had been watching the whole film. They were each only seeing one frame. At the same time, Hazel started missing daycare regularly. The explanation given was that she was sick. But here's what nobody flagged at the time. Cammy's own son, who attended a separate facility, had no absences during that same stretch. Not one. That detail passed without a single question. Then at the end of September, Brandon mentioned almost in passing during a routine conversation with a social worker that Hazel had touched a hot stove about a week earlier. He said they hadn't taken her to a doctor because Cammy had tried but was turned away due to not having legal guardianship. The story didn't hold together, but no urgent visit was scheduled. No follow-up call was made. The case moved on to the next checkbox. On October 3rd, Hazel was finally seen by a doctor. What he found was enough to make an immediate referral. He wanted her examined at a specialized pediatric clinic in Seattle. Medical staff followed protocol and notified Child Protective Services. But instead of escalating the case to a dedicated specialist, the department left it sitting with the same regular social worker who was already managing 24 other open cases. 24. The referral was noted. The appointment was scheduled, and the case file moved to the bottom of a very tall stack. 12 days later, on October 15th, Hazel ended up in a hospital again. This time it was her eye. Brandon's explanation was that she had gotten into Cammy's cosmetics and accidentally hurt herself while playing. The doctors who examined her were not convinced. The nature of the injury raised questions that the explanation did not answer. The following day, the assigned social worker came by, confirmed that potentially harmful substances had been moved out of reach, wrote a note in the file, and closed out the visit. Nobody asked the one question that was sitting right there on the surface. How does a 3-year-old child end up in a hospital twice in 2 weeks from 2 separate household incidents? That question was never asked. Not out loud, not on paper, not to anyone. Then on November 13th, Brandon brought up something else. He told the social worker that Hazel's hair was thinning and he thought it might be stress-related. He offered no further explanation. The worker recorded his exact words and moved on to the next item on the checklist. What Brandon had just described, hair loss in a 3-year-old, is a documented physical response to prolonged and severe distress. It is not subtle. It is not ambiguous. It is the kind of detail that, in a different system with a different caseload and a different set of protocols, would have stopped the meeting cold. Instead, it became another line in a growing file that nobody was reading as a whole, because that was the core failure at the center of this entire case. Every single signal that came in was being processed in isolation. Relatives who called in August, educators who reported in September, doctors who flagged concerns in October, the hair loss reported in November. Each one was treated as its own separate, unconnected event. Different departments received different pieces of information and never compared notes. Workers rotated in and out, and with every transition, institutional memory evaporated. No single person ever sat down with all of it in front of them and asked, what does this add up to? And there was another problem that cut even deeper. Cammy Dixon, the person who was with Hazel the most, the person who functioned as the primary caregiver in Brandon's absence, had never been formally assessed in that role. Not once. No one had conducted a proper evaluation of how she interacted with the child. No one had observed them together in an unannounced setting. No home visit had ever been structured around watching Cammy parent. She'd cleared a background check and completed a rehabilitation program, and the system had treated that as sufficient. It was not sufficient. Meanwhile, on social media, Cammy was building something that looked airtight. Her profile throughout the summer and fall read like a parenting highlight reel. Bright photos of Hazel in pink dresses, warm captions about unconditional love. A post in September where she wrote at length about how she did not draw any distinction between biological children and stepchildren, that Hazel was just as much hers as anyone. In October, she posted a video of the two of them together and wrote that this was her child. But it was during that exact same period that Hazel was missing daycare week after week. It was during that period that the medical visits were stacking up. It was during that period that the little girl who had once run everywhere and made sure nobody felt left out had gone completely quiet. On Halloween, Cammy posted the photo. Cruella de Vil Brandon as her henchman. The children dressed as puppies. The comments filled up with heart emojis and people saying how adorable. Nobody looking at that photo had any reason to think anything was wrong. That was the point. Psychologists who would later review the case described this pattern by name. The deliberate construction of a public image to deflect scrutiny. Post after post, caption after caption, each one functioning as a layer of insulation between what the world was allowed to see and what was actually happening inside that apartment. And the people who were supposed to be watching, the social workers, the department supervisors, the case reviewers, they were looking at the same feed everyone else was. Clean house, food in the fridge, and smiling child. They did not have access to Cammy's private text messages. They did not know what Autumn had witnessed and chosen not to report. They were not reading the full file. They were reading the version Cammy had written for them. And so, November arrived. Thanksgiving came and went. The family sat down for the holiday. Everything looked from the outside completely fine. It was not fine. It had not been fine for a very long time. And in a matter of days, what had been building quietly for months was about to become impossible to ignore. On the morning of November 27, 2019, Brandon Hullman went to work. It was the day after Thanksgiving. He kissed his daughter goodbye and left her in Cammy's care the same way he had done dozens of times before. Hazel was supposed to go to daycare that day. She did not make it to daycare. Instead, Cammy brought her back to her own apartment in Bellingham. What happened inside that apartment between the time Brandon left for work and 10:30 that morning has never been fully accounted for in public record. What we know is this. At 10:30, Cammy walked to a neighbor's unit and used their phone to call emergency services. She did not use her own phone. The call came in as a child who had choked on food and stopped breathing. When paramedics arrived on scene, they found Hazel unresponsive. They began resuscitation immediately and rushed her to Peace Health St. Joseph Medical Center in Bellingham. From there, given the severity of her condition, she was transferred to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, one of the most advanced trauma facilities in the Pacific Northwest. Doctors there began asking questions right away, and the answers they were getting did not line up with the story about choking. Medical findings indicated that what had happened to Hazel's body had not developed suddenly that morning. The internal picture told a story that stretched back much further than a single incident over a holiday weekend. On November 30th, 3 days after she was admitted, the medical team delivered the conclusion that her family had been dreading. The damage was irreversible. Hazel Journey Hullman was 3 years old. She was 4 days away from her 4th birthday. She never got there. She was kept on life support while her family had time to say goodbye. On December 4th, that support was removed.
It was only about 6 months ago that CPS placed her back into her father's care, and tonight that man says he is grieving for his daughter. Cammy Dixon is now scheduled to be sentenced August the 2nd.
On December 5th, Cammy Dixon was taken into custody. She was charged under Washington state law for criminal mistreatment leading to the death of a child, specifically in her role as a person responsible for that child's care. The legal language was precise. The implication was clear. What happened to Hazel was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate and sustained mistreatment by the person who had been trusted to keep her safe. But then came something that stopped many people cold. Brandon Hullman, Hazel's father, was not arrested. He was not charged. And in the days following Cammy's detention, he made a series of public statements defending her. He said that the people closest to the situation knew what Cammy had truly been to his daughter.
Only the true people know what kind of mother she was to my daughter and to our kids. We love our kids with all our heart.
He said he had questions about what happened, but that he was certain she had never intended any harm. He stood by her. Hazel's relatives sat with those words and struggled to process them. The grandmother who had spent a year and a half nursing that little girl back to health. The aunt who had watched Hazel run through the garden collecting leaves and earthworms and bringing them home like prizes. They heard Brandon speaking from a place of grief and loyalty, and they could not reconcile it with the child they had buried. On the doorstep of the house where Hazel had lived, people began leaving flowers and stuffed animals and small toys. Everything she had loved. The neighborhood that had gone about its daily routine while a 3-year-old quietly ran out of time and now stood outside in the cold and left gifts for a little girl who was no longer there to receive them. The trial of Cammy Dixon did not begin until April of 2022, 2.5 years after Hazel died. 2.5 years of motions and delays and legal preparation while a family waited for a courtroom to catch up to what they already knew. When the trial finally opened, the prosecution came in with a structured and methodical case. They were not relying on a single dramatic piece of evidence. They were laying out a timeline, months of it, and they were going to walk the jury through every single stop along the way. The text messages from Cammy's phone became one of the most significant pieces of evidence presented. Prosecutors showed the jury private exchanges that painted a picture fundamentally different from the one she had been broadcasting publicly. In one exchange, when a friend named Autumn raised what any parent would recognize as ordinary toddler behavior, Cammy's response reframed it as something deliberate, something calculated, something personal. Psychologists brought in by the prosecution identified that kind of thinking by name. They described it as a pattern of projection, attributing hostile or manipulative intent to a 3-year-old child, and they told the jury it is one of the clearest documented warning signs of a dangerous dynamic between a caregiver and a child in their care. Autumn herself took the stand. She described what she had witnessed at a children's event, the moment she had stepped in and intervened. She also told the jury about a separate incident at a holiday gathering where Cammy had become visibly agitated over the amount of attention being directed at Hazel. They had left the event early. Autumn described the weight of the decision she had made in the aftermath. She had seen something. She had not reported it, and she had carried that silence all the way into a courtroom. Medical experts presented their findings in detail. Their testimony directly contradicted the account of an accidental choking. The physical evidence, they explained, was not consistent with a single isolated event. It was consistent with a pattern, with cumulative harm, with something that had been happening over a sustained period of time. Cammy took the stand in her own defense.
I looked over at Hazel and she was slumped up against the couch.
What did you do at that point?
That didn't help. So then I'm like, well, what do? Do I do CPR? So I am not a medical professional. I am not trained, and I wish that I would have been, but
She told the jury that she had loved Hazel, that she had cared for her, that what happened on November 27th was a tragic accident and nothing more. She held to that account through cross-examination, and then Brandon took the stand.
I guess I would have been on it. Exact same way that when she got something in her eye. Exact same way when she burnt her hand.
He wept while watching video footage of Hazel and Cammy together that was played for the jury. He testified that he had not known the full extent of what was happening inside his own home, that he had been working, that he had trusted the woman he loved with the child he loved, and that he believed sitting in that courtroom that Cammy had never wanted to hurt his daughter. The relatives of Hazel who were seated in the galleries absorbed his testimony in silence. The closing arguments from the prosecution were deliberate and pointed. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury and walked them through the sheer volume of what had been labeled coincidence by the defense: the bruising, the missed daycare days, the hospital visits, the hair loss, the text messages, the social media performance running parallel to all of it. He asked the jury a direct question: at what point does the number of coincidences stop being coincidence? The jury deliberated.
Yet there's no evidence of Hazel having received medical care.
On June 28th, they returned with a partial result. They had reached a verdict on one of the two charges, but were deadlocked on the other. 2 days later, on June 30th, the final decision came in. Cammy Dixon was found guilty. The second charge was dismissed without prejudice, meaning it could potentially be refiled at a later date. On August 2nd, 2022, Cammy Dixon stood before the court for sentencing. The judge handed down 34 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation.
We're in a 3-month trial and less than 2 days of formal deliberations since we reconstituted the jury on Monday morning. So I think it's appropriate to send them back for further deliberations at this point.
When the sentence was read, the courtroom went quiet. Not the quiet of shock. The quiet of people who had been waiting a very long time and had finally arrived at the end of something. But for Hazel's family, the end of the trial was not the end of the story. Her aunt, Ashley Bartell, had not been sitting still during those 2.5 years of waiting. She had joined a child advocacy organization. She had traveled to the state capitol to protest in person. Her demand was not complicated: fix the system. And Washington State moved. In the wake of Hazel's case, the state hired hundreds of additional social workers to reduce the kind of crushing caseloads that had allowed critical signals to be processed in isolation. A new law was passed requiring mandatory background verification for every adult living in a home with a child under protective services supervision, not just official guardians, not just people whose names appeared on leases, but every adult. New communication protocols were established between departments to ensure that information flagged in one place could not simply disappear into a separate file somewhere else. And Hazel's case was formally incorporated into the training curriculum for incoming social workers across Washington State. Her name, her story, and the specific chain of failures that define the last 5 months of her life are now taught as a case study in what happens when a system processes signals instead of patterns. Every March 13th, her family gathers to mark her birthday. There is always a cake, Moana-themed, because that is what she would have wanted. There are photographs spread across the table. There are stories told out loud about a little girl who ran everywhere she went, who dipped her chicken nuggets in ketchup, who climbed into the laps of sad people and hummed quiet melodies until they felt better. There are memories of a child who collected earthworms from the garden and presented them to her grandmother with the pride of someone delivering treasure. Hazel Journey Hullman was in this world for 3 years, 11 months, and 24 days. In that time, she touched more people than most adults do in a lifetime. And the changes that came after her, the laws, the protocols, the training programs, the hundreds of additional workers now carrying smaller caseloads across Washington state, those changes are protecting children right now. Children whose names we will never know because their stories will not end the way Hazel's did. That is her legacy. A little girl with round glasses and big brown eyes and a gift for making people feel seen. She could not speak for herself when it mattered most, but the people who loved her have spent every day since making sure the world heard her anyway. If this true crime documentary moved you, share it with someone who needs to see it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the case. And if you believe the system failed Hazel, tell us why. We read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because every week we bring you true crime documentaries that go beyond the surface and ask the harder questions, the ones that actually matter. Hazel's story is one of thousands, and every single one of them deserves to be told.